Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, this is one I did a while back. So unlike many of my reaction videos, this is a video I've seen before. If you've been with the channel for more than a couple months, you may remember that I did a reaction to Atun-Shei's Why Gods and Generals is Neo-Confederate Propaganda and Objectively Sucks. And if you saw that, you may have seen a side of me you don't normally see, which was that I was getting pretty frustrated, almost angry over the direction that he went with some of this. And the comments then were equally kind of frustrated and angry, especially fans of Atun-Shei, and I know there are a lot of you out there. So I eventually took it down, not so much because of all the hate comments I was getting, which is fine, I can just turn comments off, but because I wasn't real proud of how I handled some of the stuff in the video. So I wanted to revisit it now, since many of you have asked me to do that, and try to take a measured approach to this, a more measured approach. Unlike most of his videos, where I'd say I probably agree with 90% of what he says, this one's going to be a little different. I definitely disagree with a lot of his takes in this one. So we're going to dive into it, and as always, let me know what you think in the comment sections below. But understand that I'm coming at this from my own perspective, and he has his, and both are okay. We're just going to disagree on this one, so let's go ahead and dive in.
The Birth of a Nation. It's also objectively terrible. The extended edition is nearly 5 hours long, and frankly, I'd rather face a firing squad than put myself through it again. It's exhausting and sanctimonious, and if you're not a huge Civil War buff like me, you'll just get nothing out of it. But oddly enough, this dull, flaccid, utterly inane excuse for entertainment is an extremely effective piece of propaganda. Watching this, I get the creepy sense that the entire reason Gods and Generals exists is to convince Civil War buffs that the Confederacy wasn't really all that bad.
I didn't get that at all.
About states' rights after all.
So, and I think, like I said at the beginning, that this comes down to a matter of perspective. I understand that he comes at this series of videos from the perspective of a guy who grew up subscribing to the lost cause theory, the idea that somehow the Confederacy was this noble cause that was fighting for states' rights, and slavery really wasn't the main reason, and all those kinds of things, and that because he has come out of that, he has kind of an automatic, you know, sometimes when we used to subscribe to something and now we don't, we have a very kind of knee-jerk reaction to anything that might remind us of something we once thought. And so I get the impression from all his videos that he has a natural kind of built-in bias toward anything that he thinks smells of the lost cause. I'm coming at this from a very different perspective. I've never subscribed to the lost cause theory. I've, grew up in the North, definitely Yankee Town. Most of my ancestors fought for the North. I had a few who fought for the South in Kentucky. So I guess it's probably a matter of perspective that I just don't see the lost cause stuff that he sees here. But we'll talk about it step by step as we go along.
And that the antebellum South was just a porch-sitting, lemonade-sipping paradise.
Here is to the sultry, balmy South.
That is one of my absolute least favorite parts of that movie. And I will grant him this. There's a lot of cringeworthy moments in this movie. Most of it centering around the non-military parts for me. The civilian stuff, some of the dialogue. Anyway.
As we'll see, the truth was otherwise.
We'll take the ones Platt and Eliza.
Sold, Eliza and Platt, splendid.
Before we proceed, I'd like to get one thing absolutely clear. The Confederate States of America existed primarily to preserve and expand the institution of slavery.
Not wrong. Regardless of what individual soldiers may have been fighting for, and many of those individual soldiers had no skin in the game when it came to slavery, and did see it as a fight for states' rights, a fight to defend their homes against an invading Northern army. The Confederate States of America as a political institution was absolutely formed around the idea of protecting the institution of slavery. There is no arguing that whatsoever.
Confederate soldiers were fighting for slavery, and they knew it.
That's not an opinion, it's a fact.
As the saying goes,
facts don't care about your feelings.
If you disagree, I encourage you to watch on and have your beliefs challenged in a healthy way.
Now, one of the things I will say, and again, maybe this is just my perspective on it, that I get the impression that unlike, say, someone like Mr. Beat, who has biases, as I do, but acknowledges those biases. From the videos that I've watched of Atun-Shei, and I'll put links in the description to my other reactions to his stuff, and like I said, I agree with most of them. The reactions I've done to his stuff, I get the impression that he doesn't really leave room for there to be opinions other than the ones he holds. He kind of comes across like these are the facts, when a lot of them are really just his views on things. And he basically says, this is the way it is, and if you disagree with me, you're wrong.
Because if you truly know that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, then surely one YouTube video by a confirmed FARB isn't going to change your mind, right? As early as 1922, Vladimir Lenin recognized film as an important tool for spreading political propaganda. In his case, he was trying to reinforce Marxist principles in the minds of the Russian people. But even before Lenin, and certainly ever since, film has been used to further the spread of pretty much every ideology under the sun. There's fascism, anti-fascism, classical liberalism, militarism, anti-militarism, leftism, nationalism, anti-nationalism, theism, anti-theism, anti-colonialism, and so on. But just because these films advocate a certain point of view doesn't automatically make them manipulative or bad. Some propaganda pieces are more insidious than others, and often a film with a bias can be thought-provoking in a positive and enlightening way.
Every film's going to have bias because it's going to be told from a certain perspective. Just the nature of film tends to be bad guy and good guy. Most World War II movies, the Nazis are the bad guys, the Allies are the good guys. Braveheart obviously is meant to show Scotland as the good guys and England as the bad guys, things like that. I get the impression, I'm sure he'll talk more about this, that in his mind, any film that grays that area at all and does not portray the Confederacy as the absolute villains is going to be seen as propaganda.
Agree with the message. I can still dig a good propaganda film if it's well made or entertaining. But whether benignly thought-provoking or blatantly ideological, these movies have one thing in common. The filmmakers are trying to sell you something. In the case of Gods and Generals, director Ron Maxwell is pushing the tired, old, thoroughly debunked, right-wing talking points of the lost cause myth. But Andy, I hear you thinking, you've made several videos criticizing Confederate apologists. Your position on this issue is clear. Surely you have a bias of your own. In a way, this video is a piece of propaganda too.
Yeah.
Whoa, meta dude! And for that matter, doesn't every filmmaker have their own biases that filter into their work, consciously or not? Well, no.
See, that's exactly my issue with him. He acts like he doesn't have any biases, and when he brings it up and says, "Hey, but don't you have a bias?" He's like, "No, I don't." Yes, you do. You definitely do. And your bias grows out of your upbringing and the beliefs you once held that you now reject. And it's great that you reject them. But that has created a bias in you where any hint of anything that reminds you of the beliefs you once had now makes you think that that is some evil propaganda piece. And it's not. Other people can see the same thing and not see it that way.
For example, let's briefly look at a film that many consider to be right-wing propaganda, but which actually isn't. S. Craig Zahler's Dragged Across Concrete. It's about two aging, old-school cops who get suspended because they use excessive force while arresting a Latino man. In the scene where their boss breaks the bad news, the cops voice their frustration with political correctness.
And interesting that, he's making the argument about bias, and a lot of people, I'm not one of them, would look at this and think Vince Vaughn, Mel Gibson, they're both right of center in Hollywood, where that's pretty rare. So yeah, it must be biased.
The liberal distrust of police officers, which they feel inhibits their ability to properly do their job. Some audiences saw this scene as an implicit endorsement of this conservative, anti-PC viewpoint, but nothing could be further from the truth. If you actually watch the movie, which is pretty damn good by the way, it's clear that the characters played by Mel Gibson and Vince Vaughn are not winking at the audience. It's just that they're aging, old-school cops. They've been doxxed by the Twitter outrage machine, so of course they would express those views in that situation.
So why can't we then... Here's what's frustrating me. He's making the argument that these guys, from their perspective, this is how they see the world. And then he says that film's not promoting how they see the world. It's just showing that that's how they see the world. That's exactly what Gods and Generals does with the Confederacy. It's not promoting their viewpoint. It's just showing how they saw things. And that's a theme you're going to hear from me a lot in this video. Just because you show someone believing something does not mean that you are advocating for that belief. And he just made that argument here. But then he's going to turn around and argue against that when it comes to Gods and Generals. That's what I don't understand.
There's a big difference between fictional characters in a movie expressing certain opinions.
Figure a man's only good for one oath at a time. I took mine to the Confederate States of America.
And a filmmaker trying to indoctrinate his or her audience with a specific political agenda.
Disagree. Everything he's going to argue right here was also applied in Gettysburg. Same things, right? There are scenes of triumphant music showing the Confederates, close-ups of the rebel flag, which, by the way, that's a battle flag. That's not the Confederate flag, but that's neither here nor there. Same things in Gettysburg, but he doesn't argue that Gettysburg is Neo-Confederate propaganda. Same director, same exact things happening. The fact is, the stuff that's shown in Gods and Generals, the Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of Chancellorsville, primarily the Battle of Fredericksburg to an extent, those were all Confederate victories. There's really not a lot of stuff you can show with the Union doing well in those battles. In Gettysburg, the Union has some really great moments. They win the battle, and you see some triumphant stuff. If they had ever made the third movie in the trilogy, which was The Last Full Measure, you would have seen a lot more of that, because it was mostly going to be focused on stuff where the Union did better. That's just kind of the way the history went.
I'm about to explain in detail why Gods and Generals fits into the latter category, and in so doing, spits historical accuracy right in the face. Gods and Generals is a stupid movie. It's not Paul Blart Mall Cop kind of stupid. But because it completely lacks depth and nuance, it has to telegraph to the audience what they should be feeling at any given moment.
Don't a lot of movies do that, though? I mean, it feels to me, and listen, I'm no expert when it comes to filmmaking, so maybe I'm wrong about this, but isn't that the whole point of dialogue and music in a lot of cases, is trying to portray an emotion? Maybe not even so much what I'm supposed to be feeling, but trying to help me identify with the characters. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that.
The principal way it does this is through the use of its score. Take this scene, where the Virginia House of Delegates declares that state's intention to secede from the Union.
How could there be union with a section of the country that wants to impose its will through coercion?
Oh, you mean like slavery does?
He's not wrong about slavery, but that is exactly how the South saw that. I'm not agreeing or defending them. They absolutely had a double standard where they were arguing for their right to make their own decisions while systematically denying that to an entire race of people. That's a fact. We get that. But that's exactly how the South saw that. So I don't see a problem with them using dialogue that says this is what they were thinking and feeling in this moment.
Never mind, we'll get to that. So at this point, Robert E. Lee has gotten up in front of everybody and accepts the position as commander of the Confederate Army. Watch this, and listen carefully. Did you notice that? The soaring, triumphant John Williams-y music? What might have motivated that choice? What does the director, Ron Maxwell, want us to feel in this moment?
That the Confederacy, in their minds, is starting a new nation. To them, this was a second war of independence. To them, they saw what they were doing as exactly what the Continental Congress was doing in 1776, what the militia under George Washington was doing when they were fighting at places like Bunker Hill. In their minds, it was no different. And they're portraying that. I get that. That's just the reality of it. Again, maybe it's because I'm seeing this from a different perspective than he is, but I don't see any of this as promoting the Confederacy.
Either he's a complete moron and thinks that every rousing speech needs triumphant music, or he wants us to feel inspired and uplifted that the South is seceding from the Union. I'm leaning toward the latter, especially when you see scenes like this.
And we're making assumptions about what somebody was thinking and feeling, and I think it's a dangerous thing to do that.
In my own Rockford County, only one person voted against leaving the Union. Probably the village idiot.
Exactly how they saw things.
Yeah, the village idiot was the one who wanted to prevent a fucking war.
Again, looking at it from 2021 perspective and saying, yeah, good for that guy that he stood up against that and didn't want to go to war and, stood up for what he believed in. Awesome. That's not how most people would have seen that. The people that you see there, that's how they would have acted. I can look at that and think, man, you people don't know what you're doing. Don't make this choice.
What an idiot. Consider also the sequence depicting the Battle of Chancellorsville. Now, this is as close as Gods and Generals comes to a climactic moment, and historically it was the Confederacy's greatest victory, where Stonewall Jackson brilliantly steamrolled over the Federal right flank. Check out the music in this scene. This cue turns the battle scene into nothing less than Neo-Confederate porn.
Disagree completely. Watch the scene before Pickett's charge in Gettysburg. That is a much, much more kind of inspiring score where they're really trying to build you up to feel what they're feeling for Robert E. Lee as they're cheering for him and they're getting ready to fight this battle. This one, to me, comes across as much more kind of ominous, that kind of music, that beat as they're marching. It's also, like he said, to me, the high watermark for the Confederacy. This was where their odds were the greatest against them, and yet they win a stunning victory. Stonewall Jackson's kind of crowning moment, he will be mortally wounded by his own men later that night. So it's absolutely meant to be all those things. But you compare that scene to the scene in Gettysburg where, like I said, before Pickett's charge, the one in Gettysburg to me is much more pro-Confederate than even this one is when it comes to the score. I just don't see it that way.
The bellicose chorus turns the Army of Northern Virginia into this unstoppable, completely badass, avenging force.
Kind of what they were in that moment.
Get your blood pumping, and it succeeds. It's a great cue. I'm as anti-Confederate as they come, and this scene has even me going, yeah, fuck them Yankees up, pour it into them, boys.
See, I didn't feel that at all. Anyway, I'm beating a dead horse.
Finally, let's look at Stonewall Jackson's death scene at the end of the film. Spoilers, by the way. This is an incredibly melodramatic scene. It's just goofy and all over the place. But what's really telling is the heavenly choir singing in the score.
Okay, so the scene, as near as I can tell from the history, is word for word what happened. The things that he said, the interactions he had with his wife and his doctor, calling for A.P. Hill and saying, let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees. His viewpoint on his faith, being happy about the fact that he was dying on a Sunday and that by the end of the day he would be with the Lord. The music to me fits with all of that. It doesn't mean that Stonewall Jackson was a hero to be admired for fighting for the Confederacy. It doesn't mean that we can't recognize that the man was a slave owner and had some really weird quirks as well. But it fits to me.
It indicates martyrdom, and even though Jackson got pointlessly gunned down by his own men by mistake, his death is depicted as a pseudo-religious sacrifice. He even has his hand raised in this saintly way.
I didn't see the sacrifice part of that.
This look comes across his face like he's seeing the gates of heaven opening up.
Which is a very common thing that happens with people when they die. I don't see the problem with that.
It's a Christ-like demise, and the film clearly implies that he gave his life nobly for a good cause.
I don't get, again, this is my perspective, but he gave his life nobly for a good cause? No, I didn't see that at all. I see a guy who died for what he believed in. Doesn't mean I see it as noble. Doesn't mean I think it was a good cause. He's inserting his own opinions there. There's nothing in there to me that says gave his life nobly for a good cause.
Last shot of the extended edition is a slow push-in on Jackson's coffin and the stainless banner draped over it. The camera settles on the top left section of the flag to the Confederate cross that we all know and love. This is what Jackson died for, the film is saying.
That is what Jackson died for. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to defend it. But it is what he died for.
His life to defend what this flag represents.
It's what he died for. Don't have to like it.
Gettysburg, Maxwell's previous Civil War film, is not a masterpiece by any means, but it does do a pretty good job of maintaining a neutral point of view.
See, now he says Gettysburg's a neutral point of view, but pretty much everything he just argued that made Gods and Generals propaganda could be said about Gettysburg. The score, the triumphant things, the portrayal of the Confederate characters. No mention of slavery on the Confederate side whatsoever.
Immortal words of George Lucas, there are heroes on both sides. It works in Gettysburg because that film focuses on military history, and apart from one little scene...
I'm fighting for my rats. Obviously, that's what we're fighting for. For your what? For our rats.
It doesn't really delve into the social or political history of the 1860s.
And I would agree with that standpoint, that viewpoint, that I wish Gods and Generals had done the same. It just stuck to the military stuff. It would have been a much better film if they had done that.
Not so with Gods and Generals. The first 45 minutes or so are filled with tedious speech after speech about the virtues of the Southern cause.
Just as we would not send any of our soldiers to march in other states and tyrannize other people.
Now these speeches, like this one here that Jackson gives before the first Battle of Bull Run, and then the one they show later, his farewell speech to the Stonewall Brigade before he takes command in the Shenandoah Valley, those are word for word what Jackson said. So there's no propaganda there. They're just showing what he said.
So will we never allow the armies of others to march into our state.
Nevertheless, Maxwell pretends that this film is a no-spin zone, and pretty much spells it out for us in this scene toward the end, where Colonel Chamberlain and his wife go to see a production of Julius Caesar starring John Wilkes Booth.
It's for the audience to decide who is hero and who is villain.
Whoa, meta, dude! It's frankly insulting that after 4.5 hours of shoving Neo-Confederate revisionism down our throats, Maxwell tells us, please make up your own mind, especially since lots of that propaganda is pretty convincing. Take these words that Maxwell puts in...
See, and again, this is my problem with it, is that I think his issue with the movie really comes down to the fact that they don't portray the Confederates as the villains. That I think is the bottom line here.
While Jackson's mouth.
If Virginia adheres to the United States, I adhere. Her determination must control.
That's what he believed.
Mine. This is my understanding of patriotism. And though I love the Union, I love Virginia more.
Understand, that time in history, that's how most people saw it. They saw their loyalty to their state more than to their nation. That's actually still true for a lot of people today. But, you know, it's often said that the way you can kind of see the difference is pre-Civil War, people referred to the United States in a plural way. The United States are a nation. And afterwards, they said the United States is a nation. You know, it went from being a collective of states to being one nation that happens to have states. And it was really only post-Civil War that this idea of the U.S. as a nation that you owe your loyalty to more than your local community or state really only happened after the Civil War.
That sounds reasonable, right? As an American, I value individualism and self-reliance. I love my country, but I do love my family, friends, and local community more. And I would fight for those things if I had to.
The North triumphs. It is not alone the destruction of our property. It is the prelude to anarchy, infidelity, the ultimate loss of free and responsible government on this continent. It is the triumph of commerce, the banks, factories.
Yeah, I hate banks too.
If the Republicans lose their little war, they are voted out in the next election and they return to their homes in New York or Massachusetts or Illinois, fat with their war profits. If we lose our country.
What?
So again, all how Stonewall Jackson would have seen things. Again, whether you agree with it or not is up to you to decide, but that was his perspective.
Profiteers are awful. Maybe this whole secession thing isn't as bad as some folks say. Maybe it wasn't just all about... Oh, look, it's Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy.
Cornerstone speech.
I wonder what he has to say.
The prevailing ideas entertained by the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle.
I think the issue here is that there's not a lot of room for nuance on Atun-Shei's part. Yes, Cornerstone speech, many speeches, the secession documents, as we said at the beginning, very, very clear that the government of the Confederate States of America was absolutely set up, built on the idea of enslaving the African people, African Americans by this point, and there's no denying that. That doesn't mean there weren't other things too. We don't need to deny slavery being the main issue to be able to also acknowledge that everything else that you just saw Stonewall Jackson saying is also true. But we can see that from the perspective that says, you know what, he was opposed to the big banks and he was opposed to the Republicans, and he saw this as the freedom to choose your own form of government. But they also were fighting for preserving slavery. All were true at the same time.
Socially, morally, and politically. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error.
A viewpoint that probably the majority of people in the North held as well, the inequality of the races. A lot of people were morally opposed to slavery, but didn't do a lot to fight against slavery because they saw slavery as the natural state for African American people, which is ridiculous, obviously. But that was how they saw things. They saw emancipation as a threat to their jobs, as a threat to their livelihoods, things like that. All wrong, obviously. And that's why a lot of people in the North were okay with abolition, with the caveat that we send them to Central America, we send them to the Dominican Republic, we send them to Liberia in Africa, things like that.
Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man.
Yep, true. How they saw it.
Subordination to the superior race.
Now, notice what he's doing here. And I don't disagree with it in this case. I think it fits. The ominous music, the tone that he's using, the effect that he has on his voice. What's the purpose of all that? He wants you to feel an emotion. Everything he just argued that Gods and Generals does, he's doing here. What's the difference?
Is his natural and moral condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon its great physical, philosophical, and moral truth.
See how easy it is to fall for this lost cause shit? And if God's in...
I didn't fall for it. See, that's, again, this is a defensive reaction on his part because he once fell for that. A lot of us never did. So I get that he's concerned. I understand. He's concerned other people will fall for it like he once did. And he's worried that this movie will do that. Here's the bottom line. If you already subscribed to the Lost Cause ideas, yeah, you might be able to watch this and say, well, yeah, see, they're defending what I already know to be true. But if you don't, like I don't and I never have, I can watch this and not see it that way at all. So really, it's what did you bring into it? What did you come into the movie already thinking, already believing? I'd love to hear from some of you guys who maybe don't have an opinion one way or the other, maybe especially people in other countries who have seen the movie. What did you think? And what did you feel? I'd love to hear from maybe somebody who doesn't have the bias that either I have or that Atun-Shei has. How did it leave you feeling about things? Let me know your perspective.
Generals is a neutral examination of Civil War history, as Maxwell claims. Then shouldn't the Yankees get just as much play as the Confederates?
Not in this movie, because this movie is primarily focused on a time when the Confederacy was doing really well. And the Yankees do get a lot of play, but this really, you could argue, as a Stonewall Jackson biopic. You know, he's the main character in this, and so that's why they get more play. But the notion that the Yankees are portrayed as the bad guys or incompetent really rests more on the fact that they just sucked in the early part of the war in the Eastern Theater. That's the bottom line.
Well, yeah, they should, but they don't. Not even close. With the exception of the Chamberlain brothers, Buster Kilrain, and Winfield Scott Hancock, all of whom are minor, incidental characters, the Yankees in this film are either portrayed as asshole bureaucrats.
I trust you're not being too hasty yourself, Colonel. This is a great opportunity for you.
Francis Blair was kind of an a-hole bureaucrat. That's who he was, and that's who that is. Gods and Generals is based on a book, Gods and Generals, just like Gettysburg was based on the book The Killer Angels. In those books, there are point-of-view characters. Those are the characters that you see this film through the eyes of. The point-of-view characters on the Union side were Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, Winfield Scott Hancock, primarily. That's why we see them most primary in the movie, because they were the point-of-view characters in the book.
To serve your country.
Asshole politicians.
I congratulate the Army that the numbers of casualties have been comparatively so small.
Literally what Lincoln said in the letter. So after Fredericksburg, this is what they were told, and they respond exactly as they would expect to.
Compared to what? The Scots at Culloden.
Or asshole generals who don't listen to good advice from their subordinates.
Which he didn't.
General Hancock, I certainly appreciate your efforts at reconnaissance, but this possibility has been considered and rejected.
And of course,
that's what happened. Hancock wanted to cross the Rappahannock before the pontoon boats arrived. Burnside rejected it. That's a fact. They're just showing what actually happened.
Plundering, thieving violators of our homes and firesides.
Which is exactly what happened. This literally did happen when they went into Fredericksburg. They started looting. There were Union soldiers dressing up like women and dancing in the streets. Marsina Patrick did have to come along and start slapping some soldiers around to get them to stop doing this.
This is an old lost cause stereotype of the Union Army, that it was an aggressive, invading force that attacked Southern civilians, burned their homes, and confiscated their property.
They did all those things. I don't have a problem with the fact they did those things, but they did those things. Grant's army, marching down toward Vicksburg, burned a lot of homes. There were dozens of Union soldiers in Grant's army, particularly I think in the 6th Kansas, that were indicted and in many cases executed for raping Southern women. That's just a fact. I mean, you can agree or disagree with the strategy. You can agree or disagree with Sherman's March to the Sea, for example. But stating that it happened is not trying to portray the Union as evil. That's just what happened. If the Confederacy had been shown, if it had been a major thing, you could see scenes like Jubal Early burning Chambersburg. But burning Chambersburg wasn't a part of this story. So it isn't something they would have shown. But it happened on both sides.
While this sort of thing did occasionally happen,
Occasionally?
the worst offenses weren't committed by the regular Federal Army, but by pro-Union paramilitaries, particularly out west in Kansas and Missouri.
Not true. A lot of those things were done by people under Grant, under Sherman, in the actual Federal Army. Now, the vast majority of Union soldiers, my family among them, were good men who did the right thing, who did not do those kinds of things. But you always have a few who do.
What the hell is this red leg doing here?
In fact, you know what? I'm going to pause right here and let me back this up with some facts. So, right here. So there's a book recently that talked about there were 109,000 cases of gonorrhea and 73,000 cases of syphilis among U.S. white troops. We don't have the stats for the Confederacy because most of those records were destroyed. 450 cases of rape or attempted rape, and those were just the ones that made it to the Union military courts. And in fact, it says most of the rapes that Northern soldiers committed were of black women. That's not something that gets portrayed in Gods and Generals. If it did, he'd probably argue even more that that was something that was, trying to make the Union look bad. Now, again, there were 2 million men who served in the Union Army, so this is a tiny percentage. But to argue that, it didn't really happen in the Union Army, it only happened with the irregulars out in Kansas and Missouri. No, it did happen. I was reading a book recently on the Vicksburg campaign before my trip to Vicksburg, and they talked about how you could see in the distance, the one by one, the smoke rising from burned homes as Grant's army marched through, and they would burn whatever homes they came across, plantations, things like that. There's even the National Park Service talks about, for example, the town of St. Joseph and how there's only one remaining home that survived being burned in that town in 1863. It was a very common thing that was happening as the armies came through. They were destroying the plantations. They were allowing the runaway slaves to come into their lines, which I'm glad they did, and gave those people freedom, but it's just the reality.
You said regular federal authorities would be handling this.
Captain Terrell is the regular federal authority now.
Captain Terrell is a bloodthirsty son of a bitch. He is a looter and a pillager.
So Maxwell goes out of his way to portray the Confederates as plucky rebels fighting against an evil federal empire.
I didn't see it that way at all. You don't see the Confederates plundering because everything that's done in this part of the war was done in the South. They weren't going to plunder their own people.
And with a couple notable exceptions, that wasn't the case historically. Secession was orchestrated by an aristocratic planter class that correctly anticipated the imminent end of American slavery that was so vital to the Southern economy.
True.
Even white Southerners who advocated conditional abolitionism, such as phasing slavery out over a long period of time, knew that without millions of free laborers, the agrarian economy of the Cotton States would suffer, maybe even collapse. So the planters, who had enormous political influence, ultimately decided that they would rather rip the country in half than risk their bottom line.
All true. But there were also a lot of northern businesses, northern industries that benefited from slavery, textile mills, things like that, who were able to get their materials from southern plantations at a cheap cost because of the cheap cost of maintaining slavery. But let's face it, the vast majority of farmers in the South were not slave owners. They weren't plantations. They were subsistence farmers, which means they basically farmed enough to feed their own families and maybe have a little bit to sell to buy other needed supplies. Most of them were not directly... I disagree with the idea that all agrarian people in the South benefited directly from slavery. That doesn't mean that there weren't a lot of people who benefited from slavery who didn't own slaves. That's true. And he's absolutely right that secession was orchestrated by a planter class that had a lot to lose if slavery went away. Won't disagree with that whatsoever.
Most of the famous Confederate soldiers came from the planter class. Robert E. Lee was born rich, the son of a dynastic political family. His father was governor of Virginia, and his uncle served in the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War.
You see, it's here a Lee, there a Lee, and everywhere a Lee, a Lee.
Jeb Stuart's father was a plantation owner and career politician. Nathan Bedford Forrest, though born poor, amassed a huge fortune before the war through speculation and slave trading. My boy James Longstreet grew up on a plantation. P.T. Beauregard was from a stinking rich family in DeParish. George Pickett came from old Virginia money and got most of his career opportunities through nepotism. Thomas J. Jackson, well, Stonewall was a bit different, but we'll get more into that.
He actually grew up, he was born in West Virginia, what is now West Virginia.
Later. Yet in Gods and Generals, we see privileged, elitist Yankees in a parlor with their whiskey and cigars, while the Confederates huddle around a simple campfire with their men.
That's not... First of all, a lot of the Yankee generals were also privileged elitists. That's a fact. I don't see anything not true here. The Confederates were, but we also see the I'm getting all over the place here, but for example, we're looking at, this is Chancellorsville. The scene he shows is that famous bivouac scene where they make the plan for the flank attack at Chancellorsville, which happened around a fire. If you go there today, it's in the middle of freaking nowhere. There's no houses nearby. So their meeting did take place out in the open around a fire. But we also saw all of the scenes with the Confederates at Christmas, in the Lacey home, dressed up, looking nice in a beautiful home with, their drinks and their food and their Christmas celebration. Everybody dressed really well. So we do see those scenes with the Confederates. The scene he juxtaposed this with the Union was Hancock and Couch meeting in their headquarters, which I believe would have been at the Stafford house, or on Stafford Heights. Forget the name of the house. That overlooks Fredericksburg, and that was used as a Union headquarters. So none of this is inconsistent with the facts.
Y'all need to stop pretending that these guys were men of the people. They weren't. I
don't see it that way. They're just he's cherry picking scenes to make his argument. Why don't you show the scenes of them in winter quarters when they were in those nice places too? Why don't you show the scenes of Union soldiers laying in the middle of a field for 3 nights? He's just trying to make an argument by pulling scenes that will make that argument.
They were men of privilege, dedicated to preserving the status quo.
On both sides.
And just what was that status quo?
It is the systematic coercion of one group of men over another.
Well said, Chamberlain, you overhyped hack. Strong Vincent rolls in his grave every time the history books mention you. By the way, this scene with the Chamberlain brothers is interesting.
Freeing the slaves wasn't a war aim when this all began.
It wasn't.
War changes things. It sorts things out.
I don't know, Lawrence. Not everybody feels the way we do about the darkies. Especially when it comes to fighting and dying.
Which is exactly how a lot of Union soldiers felt. And when the Emancipation Proclamation came out, soldiers, particularly soldiers from places like Southern Illinois, which was very pro-slavery, a lot of them decided to quit en masse and had to be convinced or sometimes held at gunpoint in the army because they did not want to fight for slavery, to abolish the slaves. They were fighting to preserve the Union. There were a lot of Union soldiers who saw it that way.
This is the only racial slur used by anyone in the entire movie. This neutral, nonpartisan Civil War film features one racial slur, and it comes out of the mouth of a Union soldier. And how do the Confederate characters treat black people? Why, like members of the family, of course.
All right, so we're going to stop right there for today, and you'll find that in this next part where he talks about how slavery is portrayed, I probably agree with about half of what he says on that. I certainly agree with that more than I agree with a lot of what we just talked about. So bear with me. I know a lot of my Atun-Shei fans out there, whenever I disagree with something he says in one of these reaction videos, I get more dislikes on my videos over his stuff than anything else I do. So I'm prepared for it. But understand, I agree with most of what he says in most of his videos, just not in this one. And I'm open to being wrong about that. I have my bias. I have my viewpoint just as he does. It's just at least I'm willing to acknowledge mine. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. See some of my other reactions to his stuff that I'll put in the links. And we'll be back tomorrow with the next part of this. Thanks for watching.